Okay, welcome to lesson 12 of Reconstruction in the West. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at white settlement in the western part of the United States. We're going to take a look at the three different draws, the three different things that pulled people into the West. Those three economic activities would be farming, cattle raising, cattle ranching, and mining. Those are going to be the three big things that take people out into the West. And then the rest of society, the rest of economics, is going to come from those three areas. First of all, we'll take a look at mining. And mining becomes very important in the late 1800s, not only because of the precious metals, the gold and silver that can be found out west, but also back in the East, we have a lot of innovation. This is where electricity really starts to be mass-produced and used in factories instead of water power. And so since we're converting over from water power to electricity, we need copper for wire, for building machinery, for building the stuff that the electricity is going to be used for. And so copper mining becomes very important during this time. Copper mainly found in Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. A lot of copper mines out there, and even today in Utah, there's a lot of copper mining that still goes on. But when you take a look at what they're using that copper for, it's not only for the electrical machinery that's being produced, but also some new inventions that allow us to communicate better. You had telegraph wires that were being strung across the country. And when we take a look at the Old West, a lot of people think of the Pony Express, that messenger system that could get a piece of mail out to California in only a matter of days. Well, the problem with the Pony Express is it only lasts, I think, 18 months. It may have lasted 11 months, less than a year. And it lasts such a short period of time. It was a great idea. The problem is that the telegraph becomes very popular almost immediately after that. And so the telegraph lines begin to be strung all the way across the nation. And that allows for fast communication, even faster than the Pony Express. And so with the telegraph being such a great new invention, the Pony Express goes away. But then even the telegraph goes away, and those telegraph wires are replaced by telephone wires. And you would see pictures of cities back during this time, and we're going to take a look at urbanization in the next unit. But you would take a look at how these telephones were being strung, and you would just have dozens of telephone lines being strung down streets to the point where it was almost as thick as the leaves on the trees, that there was so much copper being used, and all of that copper was coming from out west. The Comstock lode is discovered in Nevada in 1859, and the Comstock lode was a very rich area of gold and silver mining. Population heavily increases in Nevada until they achieve statehood in 1864. And $14 million worth of gold and $21 million worth of silver come out of the Comstock lode in 1877 when it reaches its peak. But then by 1880, the Comstock lode has pretty much run out. Even today, you still find gold and silver mines out in Nevada and California, but it was nowhere close to the amount of production that was coming out of those mines in the late 1800s. Now, again, you got to keep in mind that we had taken over all of that territory from Mexico. So how much would history have changed if Mexico was able to get its hands on the California gold mines and the Nevada Comstock lode and all that copper mining that was out out west in all of those territories that we took? And so history could change quite a bit just because of that Spanish-American or the Mexican-American War that occurred only 30 years previous to this. The second area that is really booming is cattle raising, cattle ranching. And when we build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s, it becomes a very important means for transporting cattle from the west out back to the east so that people could get meat. Before this, meat was a luxury in a lot of cities. in order to transport the meat, you either had to transport the cattle live, which was very costly, or you had to butcher the meat very close because that meat was going to go bad very quickly. And so fresh meat was quite a luxury. You do have salted pork, salted beef, but fresh meat was quite a luxury. And it's really the Transcontinental Railroad that allows us to bring meat into the cities very quickly. Those cattle were driven onto trains, train stations that were spread all over the West, and then those trains would take them to stockyards in Kansas City and Chicago, and then they would be taken on further than that. Now, keep in mind that one of the innovations that we do, and this is actually one of our earliest examples of genetic modification, is to cattle. When you put those cattle onto trains, you were trying to pack them in very close together. And when they are longhorned steers that have the big long horns coming out the side, they would often gore each other. And so you'd end up with a lot of dead cattle before you actually reach to the stockyards. And so what ranchers begin to do is they begin to breed their cattle to have shorter horns, so that way they can't gore each other as much and you can fit more of them on a train. And so that's kind of an interesting innovation that comes from this time. And third, the third western frontier is that of farming. There are a couple of innovations that make farming more able to be accomplished out west. And the first is that singing plow that's able to cut through those deep root systems of those prairie grasslands. Once we're able to cut through that, we find a lot of very good soil, the world's best soil, and absolutely shatters that myth of the Great American Desert. Also, what we do is we import a strain of grain from Russia that was used to living in cold weather. And so the Great Plains get very hot during the summer, but they have some of the most severe cold in the entire country during the winter. And so in order to extend that growing season, you brought in grain that could live earlier in the spring and later in the fall. And when you have grain that has that longer growing season, you're able to produce more of it. Two guys that really become important here. One of them is John Pillsbury of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and his bakeries, his process of making pre-made dough that could be shipped across the country really increases demand for grain. He makes flour, he makes dough, all of those kinds of things. But it's really his flour mills that he was able to mass produce flour. Before this, people would just take the grain and they would make the flour themselves. But Pillsbury mechanizes that and makes it very profitable. The second guy is Joseph Glidden. Joseph Glidden, in 1874, invents barbed wire. Now, you have these two conflicting frontiers of the West. You have the farmers on one side and the ranchers on the other. And the ranchers wanted to let their cattle graze all over the place, and they would end up going on to farmers' land and eating all their crops. And so in order to protect them, those crops, they needed to build fences. But to build fences around this huge, expansive acres and acres and acres of land was very expensive, very time-consuming, especially since there wasn't a whole lot of wood out west to build fences from. And so Joseph Glidden comes up with barbed wire. He was able to make just miles and miles and miles of wire that had little spokes on it, which would keep the cattle out. Which meant that you could make fences with much less wood, and you could make fences very quickly that expanded long areas. And so we have the division of the Great Plains using Joseph Glidden's barbed wire. Gave his farmers a lot of protection, but really hurt the cattle ranchers who would often cut through these fences, which creates a lot of tension between the ranchers and the farmers.